The 1990s were a strange time for horror movies. While good films were definitely still being made, 1992's Candyman being one of the strongest examples, overall, the genre had lost the hook it had had in popular culture throughout the late 70s and early 80s. Jokey, stereotyped, often direct to video slasher sequels had become the dominating presence, and audiences were not impressed nor scared. But just when it seemed that horror was on the verge of fizzling out, one film came along and revitalized the genre. The basic premise was not unlike the classics of slashers past, a group of high school students, the story centering on the more demure female lead facing off against a creepy antagonist. But the angle of this film set it apart from other horror movies of its day. It took what had become tired tropes and imbued them with satire, charisma, and reverence for the works that it had been inspired by. The psychology of the antagonist, while not heavily focused on, gives the film a certain dramatic weight. Starring the legendary, always lovely Drew Barrymore and the wonderful David Arquette, the film cleverly turns not only one genre on its head, but two: horror and romance. It explores how being a social outcast during one's formative years can mold a person into the perfect victim for a predatory teacher, even when that person is in fact a grown adult woman and the teacher only thinks that she is a 17-year-old girl. Of course, I'm talking about the 1999 horror staple Never Been Kissed. Now, what's so interesting about the film is that how it disguises itself as a romantic comedy. What? Wait. Never Been Kissed is genuinely a romantic comedy. But it's so creepy. The teacher guy falls for Drew Barrymore while fully thinking she's a student. Fine. Were there any actual high school-based horror films of the 1990s starring Drew Barrymore and David Arquette?
No.
All right. I guess we're talking about Scream.
Is it just me? Or is it getting crazier out there?
So, Scream, 1996. I thought that now would be the perfect time to go back and talk about this movie since, as of this recording and when this comes out, Scream 6 will be newly in theaters, which I'm very excited for. Now, I'm not going to talk about the sequels. Maybe I might touch on them a little bit, but I want to focus mostly on the original. And this film, I know it's been talked about so much since it came out and in the many years since, but like I said in my beginning bit, which was all true other than the Never Been Kissed thing, which I sincerely think that Never Been Kissed would actually work as a horror movie, and maybe there exists like a trailer cut of it as a horror film. But it is true how slasher films in particular, but a lot of horror in general in the 90s was really on a big downslide. And Scream really did revitalize it and made people remember what was so wonderful and fun about slasher films and horror itself. And with the screenplay by Kevin Williamson, directed by Wes Craven, I mean, this movie just launched a new era of horror films. And however you think about it, it also did launch the beginning of the parody films. Kind of funny, the original working title of Scream was Scary Movie. That got changed rather late into production, actually, and ironically, that Scary Movie was the kind of the return of the parody film. Um, so And yes, like I said in my opening bit, Drew Barrymore starring in this film. Now, what's funny is that Drew Barrymore signing on was what got Wes Craven to direct it. When he received the script, he actually wasn't like he thought it was too much, especially the opening scene. But when Drew Barrymore agreed to be in the movie, she was originally going to be cast as Sidney Prescott, who would end up being played by Nev Campbell. It was Drew Barrymore's suggestion that she play well, technically second, but the big name murder victim in the opening act, which was kind of a play on what Psycho did with Janet Leigh. And the marketing just went all out with showcasing Drew Barrymore. And it was a big shock to audiences that she dies in the first 15 minutes of the movie. And when she signed on and when she chose that, Wes Craven got on board. Now, I rewatched Scream just a couple of nights ago, and not for the first time, but for the first time in a long time. And I'm really glad that I revisited it before doing this because while, I remembered most of the movie and my impressions of it, I had forgotten a lot of things, like how funny it is, especially Matthew Lillard's performance, which I'll get into that in a little bit. But the opening sequence when Ghostface is stalking and calling Drew Barrymore, oh my goodness, I was kind of unprepared for how chilling that sequence still is to this day. Barrymore's performance is absolutely incredible. You feel just such genuine terror coming from her, and it's so incredibly sad. She is just this sweet teenage girl, and she is being victimized and killed so horrifically. And yeah, just a shout out to how strong of an actress Drew Barrymore is. And I really credit her a lot for her decision to play Casey rather than Sydney. Because if not for that, Wes Craven probably never would have signed on. And I don't think this movie would have had the lasting impact that it has. But when she first answers the phone and you first hear the voice of Ghostface, Roger Jackson, oh, his voice is absolutely incredible. And I know they had kind of used his voice as a sort of stand-in, and then they realized, oh my God, this is perfect. He goes from, his voice is kind of sexy. It's a bit seductive and charming. And he switches it into villainous and absolutely terrifying so well. He is absolutely amazing. And he went on to voice Mojo Jojo in Powerpuff Girls. Just thought that was a fun fact. But what's kind of interesting about that whole opening sequence when the Drew Barrymore's character, Casey, her boyfriend, Steve, with his murder and then Casey's murder, heavily edited. They originally, when Steve is killed, he is bound to a chair and his entire abdomen is split open. And they had it with him sitting in a chair with no back and sort of cast to have the guts just kind of fall out. And in the theatrical cut, they had to cut out the falling guts because the MPAA was very unhappy with it. And Similarly, when Drew Barrymore's character is killed and she's hanging from the tree with her entire abdomen basically hollowed out, they had to show a lot less of that than they originally had filmed and everything that they did with the effects, which is, I think, kind of disappointing because the effects team did such great work. But what makes that whole opening scene so, like, even more cruel than the brutality itself is the raw emotion. And Casey's parents come home. She is a matter of feet away from them when she is finally taken down by Ghostface, and she's still holding the phone in her hands, which her mother hears, and hears her final struggling breaths. It is utterly horrifying, heartbreaking, and man, what an opening. I think, as far as modern horror and slashers go, this is one of the top opening sequences just in general. And it was just such a shock to the system for audiences at the time, where the slashers that had been coming out in the later 80s and throughout the 90s, if a lot of them were direct to video, and a lot of them just became very jokey and silly. You had the Leprechaun sequels, which, I mean, I love me some Warwick Davis, and there is a charm to them just because they are so hokey, but definitely not scary. And then Friday the 13th went leaning in heavy into kind of self-referential sort of comedy, but it didn't have it wasn't clever about it in the way that Scream is. And that is so much due to Kevin Williams's amazing screenplay. Now, many people probably know that he was inspired by the Gainesville Ripper case in the early 90s. Now, what I find really interesting about that whole case was not so much how the movie is inspired by the murders themselves, but more the media take on them. And you see a lot of parallels between this media storm surrounding the Gainesville Ripper case and other big name murder and just other cases at the time with what is going on in the fictional town of Woodsboro. You see this just media circus surrounding the murders of these young people, and only a year after Sidney Prescott's mother was horrifically murdered. And in the case of the character of Gail Weathers, played absolutely magnificently by Courtney Cox, who wrote a very salacious book about the death of Sidney's mother, and then is just on the hunt to have another big media case that is all her own. And that is something that did kind of happen with the Gainesville Ripper. There was a book written about it that was very scandalous, and it really went hard into the more salacious details of the killings and the circumstances of what happened to the victims. And it also, in the 90s, the case of violence on TV was something that was very big. At the time, the Clinton administration was trying to enforce use the V chip, which was kind of like parental controls, but news stories that were not subject to ratings would easily get around anything like a V chip, and they could be very exploitative in their coverage. And the America's idea of crime and murders changed drastically. There was this idea that there were more boogeymen than there had been before, and that murders were on the up and up and the world was unsafe, when in reality, violent crime had decreased sharply by 10% from 95 to 96, marking a third year of decline. And something else in the Danny Rolling, who was the Gainesville Ripper, another thing with his case, he was not the initial suspect. The initial suspect was a 19-year-old student named Ed Humphrey, and the media really zeroed in on him. But then, even though it was found that his blood type did not match the physical evidence found at the scenes of the crime, and that two additional murders had taken place after he had been taken into custody, he still struggled to find work and rebuild his life even after his innocence had been proven. People still associated him with those killings because he had been so focused on TV and by the news outlets. And we do see a bit of this in Scream with the character of Cotton Weary, played by Liev Schreiber. And while that is, I don't think he doesn't even have any lines in the film. He's just very much featured, which I'm so glad that in the sequels, Liev Schreiber came back and Cotton Weary became a much more pronounced character. But you do see how, the point, someone being blamed for a murder can completely change the outcome and the outlook of a murder case. Now, funny enough, in the case of Scream, you do have the very, the reporter who is, yes, she's in it to prove his innocence, but it's to boost her book sales. She's not doing it to be a good person or for karmic balance or what have you. But, she is trying to see the case through different eyes and prove that Cotton Weary is innocent to boost her own fame. And I know I said I wouldn't be talking about the sequels all that much, but I do love the character development of Gail. And even though she's portrayed as such a bitch, let's be honest, in Scream, she's so good. Like, she's so good at playing that character. And I know that Wes Craven was very hesitant to cast her. She was very, Friends was at a huge height at this point, and her character of Monica is probably the sweetest of the whole Friends gang. And I'm so glad that she was allowed to step out of that bubble and play this, this kind of mean, self-serving, manipulative character. But there is more of a depth to her, and Courtney Cox's performance really brings that out, and the sequels just expand on that more and more, and you see her developing a genuine friendship with Sydney as the series goes on. And I know most people are aware that this was the movie that introduced David Arquette and Courtney Cox. They started dating, fell in love, and got married during the course of these films. And they did end up divorcing in 2012, but remained friends since, and they reunited for. They were in the process of their divorce, I believe, during Scream 4, and then Scream 5. Obviously, only came out a year-ish ago. They had obviously been apart romantically for a long time, but it is really touching to see them reunite on screen, and kind of, in a way, their characters' relationships almost reflect their real life relationship, and their chemistry is very sweet, and you can definitely see those sparks really flying between them in the first Scream movie, and I just adore it. And David Arquette, I am so glad that he was cast as Dewey. He was actually asked to audition and was considered for the role of Billy Loomis, the boyfriend of Sidney, who, spoilers for a movie that came out in '96, is one of the two Ghostface killers. But he, partly so he could have, maybe kissy face and get close to Courtney Cox, he wanted to play Dewey. Dewey was originally written as a much more kind of hunky, macho character, but when he read for it, he brought in a softer vibe to it and more of a sense of humor that ended up really working for the film. And I love seeing how brotherly he is to Sidney, because her best friend is his younger sister, Tatum, played by Rose McGowan. Now, in preparation for this video, I went and tried to find the closest thing I could find to the sweater thing that Rose McGowan wears throughout most of the movie. This was as close as I could get. I did a lot, long time prepping. I definitely didn't go to the store an hour and a half ago and just find this and buy it for $7.99. But, that's just how I roll, baby. Something that really works for Scream is the chemistry between all of the characters. You really believe that Neve Campbell as Sidney and Rose McGowan as Tatum are best friends and have known each other for many years. You see that brother-sister kind of antagonistic relationship between David Arquette and Rose McGowan, and she calls him a doofus. He kind of is a doofus. He's 25 and he's trying to assert himself as, he's police officer man, but she's just ragging on him, and he still lives at home, and he's such a goof, and I adore him. Now, Neve Campbell as Sidney she's absolutely brilliant. She's definitely one of my favorite horror protagonists, one of my favorite final girls. She is up there, definitely neck and neck with Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street, for sure. She plays the trauma that her character has gone through so well without going overboard into melodrama. And she shows such vulnerability and sensitivity, but also such toughness. I love when she just decks Courtney Cox. The line when she's like, "Oh, I'll send you a copy of the book she had written about her mother." Just bam, cold coxer. It's amazing. And Neve Campbell did most of her own physical stunts in Scream, and I think she was very sore by the end of filming. And, mad respect for that. And she goes through it in this movie as she is chased, tossed around, thrown off of things, crawling through stuff. She goes 100%. And again, you see how her trauma affects her as the franchise progresses, but it never crosses over into her becoming a weak victim. Now, of course, she is, a victim of horrible things, but she's a survivor, and she doesn't I think it's in Scream 3, we do see her kind of drawing into herself while still being a force for good, even though by the time of Scream 3, she has kind of isolated herself and she's still very much affected by all the things that have happened to her. She is manning she is kind of manning running a domestic violence like hotline or shelter or something like that. Like she is helping other people and other women who are survivors of violence. And I think I just think that's fantastic. And she's very relatable and strong without going too tough girl and she never veers too much into the not like other girls kind of like that kind of trope. She remains a strong character in like just a strongly written character, and her Nev Campbell's performance is like cannot be understated. She's absolutely wonderful. Now, so much of the what Scream is known for is its commentary on slasher films. And much of this is done through the character of Randy Meeks, who I think who is played by Jamie Kennedy, but other actors who were up for the role, I believe Seth Green was a contender. There are a few others. And he was very close to not getting the part because he was completely unknown at the time. But they really advocated for him, and I'm so glad they did because he was absolutely perfect for this part. Probably one of the most known scenes of Scream is during the party at Stu's house when he pauses their viewing of Halloween and goes through the rules of a horror movie. You have to be a virgin, no drinking or drugs, and never ever say, "I'll be right back." Now, the rules of slashers and scary movies progress as the Scream franchise progresses. Scream 2 covers the rules of a horror sequel. Scream 3 goes into the rules of a trilogy. Scream 4, the reboot, and then Scream 5, or just, Scream, but I'll just call it Scream 5, remarks on elevated horror. And I love how relevant Scream always stays with the year and the trends of horror that are happening as it's being written and released. And I am really looking forward to see what Scream 6 does with that, the angle it's going to take. And I just do want to say for Scream 6 that while I am, again, this will be a spoiler for Scream 5, so I'll skip ahead a couple of minutes if you haven't seen it yet, but I was absolutely devastated that Dewey dies. He was the first legacy character to die since Jamie Kennedy in Scream 2. But yeah, that was utterly heartbreaking, but really, I think it was necessary and very well done, but still, because I love my Dewey. That was very upsetting. And Nev Campbell decided not to return for Scream 5, but Courtney Cox is coming back, as is Hayden Panettiere, who played one of my favorite characters in Scream 4. She kind of took on the role of Randy Meeks. She was the horror expert. And I am so glad that they never show her body, and it's left ambiguous whether she lives or dies. And if you look closely in Scream 5, you have characters watching YouTube, and you do see like on the suggested videos on the side something about, her character, like a recent interview or something. So it is established that she is alive, and I'm so happy that she's coming back. But yeah, and I just Yeah, I'm a big fan of Hayden Panettiere. I think that she's been excellent since, the first thing I saw her in was
Heroes.
Remember the Titans. Was
Heroes.
Oh, Heroes, yes, but she was already, young adult by the time she was in Heroes. But yeah, she's always been great, except for whichever Bring It On sequel she was in. Not her fault. The Bring It On sequels, even worse than the slasher sequels of the 90s. But going back to Scream, what we're here to talk about. Now, oh my goodness, Matthew Lillard. I absolutely adore Matthew Lillard, just in general. But as Stu in Scream, he's so funny and just so out there. Like, his performance goes just off the rails. And in a lot of interviews, he himself has said, like, oh, yeah, I don't know why I did that. Yeah, not a fan of what I did in that scene. Or like, whoa, what was I doing there? But I think it all works. And especially with him offsetting Billy Loomis, Skeet Ulrich. And so Skeet Ulrich brings that, he's so creepy and intense and menacing. And then Matthew Lillard, really, really good with, first of all, the chemistry between the two of them. I really do think that Stu is in love with Billy. He is always very close up on him, and he's kind of, he's helping commit the murders kind of for Billy, and that's sort of my headcanon. But take whatever interpretation you have, but just the way the two of them work together is very fun and creepy. But I know that he improv'd a lot of his lines, and particularly in the ending of the film. And for one, there were over 50 gallons of fake blood used in this movie, which is wonderful. But at one point, after it's at Stu's house when Stu and Billy have revealed themselves to be the Ghostface killers. They reveal that they were the ones who had murdered Sydney's mother and that they are planning to frame her father for all of the recent murders. Sydney gets away and is taunting them. And the line when Stu's on the phone with Sydney, and he goes, "Are you really going to call the police? My mom and dad are going to be so mad at me." It's hilarious. And at this point, he and Billy are pretty covered in blood because they've taken turns stabbing themselves to show themselves as, oh, they were stabbed, but they survived. And they're covered in blood, and I think that Skeet Ulrich was actually supposed to hang up the phone, but it slips out of his hand and smacks Matthew Lillard in the head, and that he just rolls with it like, "You hit me with the phone, dick!" It's so good. And it's when writing Scream, there was some contention with how they would approach the motive or lack thereof of their killers. A lot of people thought that it would be scarier to not have a motive, while other people thought that there needed to be. So they decided to do it both ways, and it ended up really working with the character of Billy Loomis having the motive and Stu just kind of being there. He's just sort of chaos. And he says, I think Sydney asks him like what his motive is or like what he's going to tell the police. And he goes, peer pressure. He's still just, he made me laugh out loud so many times. He's absolutely great. And then that did make me want to go back and rewatch 13 Ghosts, which is not a great film, but it is dear to my heart. It's very nostalgic for me, and very good things about it. I think production wise, it's pretty incredible, but it's another movie maybe for another day. But I also really enjoy Matthew Lillard in that, and basically anything he's in. But Skeet Ulrich, part of his casting was due to his resemblance to Johnny Depp in Nightmare on Elm Street, and it's kind of uncanny. Like even just the way he moves, and he just looks so much like him in the first Nightmare. It's kind of creepy. And I don't remember my exact thoughts the first time I ever saw Scream, but revisiting it, I'm like, oh yeah, this guy is clearly this guy's clearly the killer, or at least, at least one of them. I remember being pretty surprised that there were two killers. That Stu was one of them. I remember that being a surprise to me when I first saw this movie when it had come out in video. So, so I saw it probably, see, it came out December of 96. So I watched it sometime when it came on video in 97. But I do remember that I was surprised that there were two killers. Did not see that coming. But even Randy remarks a few times that, wow, Billy is super creepy. Like, you're telling me that isn't, like, that this isn't the face and the mannerisms of a murderer, which I do feel was trying to maybe do a red herring within a red herring, like portray it so hard that you think, oh, there's no way. And then he has his kind of fake out death. But not that I'm saying, I'm not even criticizing. It's just he plays that character just so grossly. I do enjoy it. What I also enjoy is Henry Winkler as the principal, which he filmed all of his scenes in one day. He's so fun. I mean, I love Henry Winkler in anything. And it's kind of sad that he has probably the lamest kill of all of the kills in Scream. It's not very bloody. Although the shot after he is killed of his eye with, you see Ghostface in his eye, that's kind of neat. But they ended up writing in his murder because I think like 30 minutes had gone by in the script without a murder taking place. And that also had solved a conundrum in the script in regards to the big party at Stu's house. You had a lot of other party goers still hanging out, and Randy is presenting the rules of a slasher, but then they couldn't really figure out an organic way to get all of these other extraneous characters out of there so we could get into the rest of the killings in the finale of the film. And writing in the murder of the principal that was announced, and you have the classmates all go off to go see the body that's apparently hanging from the flagpole. Thought that's a really, really good call and a really great way of getting them out of the movie so we could get to the finale. Let's see. Oh, just want to talk about the effects work, which is so good. And I wish that the movie had been able to showcase a lot more of it, but because of ratings, MPAA, blah, 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 they had to cut a lot out. But let me look at my notes here. So the producers, they recruited K&B Effects, which one of the founding members was Greg Nicotero, who is probably most known for his work on Walking Dead and Fear of the Walking Dead, but the the work they did for this film is so good, and the creation of the mask itself. Now, it wasn't an original creation of the team. They had done lots of different drawings and, different models of what the mask would be because the idea of it was just very generic. Williamson had described the antagonist as a mask killer. So Wes Craven had no specific information on what type of mask or what was going to conceal the body. So while location scouting, Wes Craven's longtime producing partner, Marianne Madalena, discovered the ghost face mask hanging on a post in the bedroom of the house that had previously been used for Shadow of a Doubt. And since they didn't own the copyright to the mask, K&B kind of tried to sculpt their own. And you can see the early, like their own creation of the mask in certain points in the film. You see it quite a bit in the opening sequence when Steve and Casey are killed, and a little bit in the sequence when the principal is killed. So the K&B mask had like squintier eyes and a smaller mouth than the original Ghostface mask, but still, even after that, Wes Craven preferred that original one, and they tracked down the makers, a company called Fun World, and it was just a small New England company, and they agreed to let the film use that mask as long as they were always given credit. And it was used for the rest of the production, and then they did some reshot inserts, so you have more of that original mask in the opening scenes. And I mean, as far as killer masks goes, Ghostface has become, it is up there with Michael Myers and the Jason hockey mask. It's so iconic, and you see that, and you can't think of anything else but Scream. And what disappoints me is that there is no screening of a Scream movie where they just give you a Ghostface costume like at the beginning of Scream 2. I would love that. Now you just have to buy them for like obscenely expensive prices nowadays, but so it goes. But one thing I want to point out as far as stunt work and effects go, I know I was talking about how Neve Campbell did a lot of her own. She did have a stunt double, but at one point, I don't know if it's the stunt woman or if it's actually Neve Campbell, but in the finale of the film, she bursts out of a closet holding an umbrella, and she stabs Billy in the shoulder with it. Now, poor Skeet Ulrich, and this is the pointy end of the umbrella. It missed the protective vest that he was wearing and actually stabbed him. So the scream of pain that Skeet Ulrich does is 100% real, because he actually did get pretty like impaled on that piece, on that umbrella pointy end. Poor this poor guy. I not that I love when actors get harmed, but I love just behind the scenes things like that. And as I was watching the movie, I was reminded of how beautiful it is. So much of it was largely shot on site rather than in a studio, and you have these beautiful landscape shots of the scenery, and it's largely, I know it's Santa Rosa is where most of the film is filmed. And funny enough, Drew Barrymore's character's house, Casey. Her house is directly across from the house used in Cujo, which is really fun. And the greatest set piece is Stu Mockery's house at the end of the film. And it's now known as the Spring Hill Estate in Tamales Bay, about 40 minutes. It's all shot about 40 minutes north of San Francisco, I believe. But they shot the ending over 21 nights, 21 night shoots for the ending of the film, and it was very taxing on the cast and crew, but I think very, very worthwhile. It came out so brilliantly. I really think that the cast and crew would agree that the hardships that they endured for almost a month of filming could not have come out any better. And just being directed by Wes Craven, it's funny in that opening scene where Casey's on the phone with Ghostface and he, says the famous line, what's your favorite scary movie? And they get talking about Halloween, which was one of the biggest inspirations for Scream, but then talk about Nightmare on Elm Street, and Casey says, "Yeah, the first one was good, but the rest suck." And Wes Craven did not write that line, which I find hilarious. And I love Wes Craven's little cameo as the janitor. The principal, Henry Winkler, comes out and he thinks that students are banging on his doors. Oh, you little shits. And he's like, what? Oh, not you, Fred. And he's wearing the Freddy Krueger hat and sweater. It's wonderful. And it's kind of blink and you miss it, but Linda Blair, from, obviously The Exorcist, she plays one of the reporters that is kind of taking over the high school and trying to the media circus. I think that's just a fun nod and something. If you see her, it's really cool. And it's kind of hard to see her or anybody over Courtney Cox's lime green suit that she wears, which I do love that they bring that back in the Stab universe that is so wonderfully molded into the Scream world. And I do love that Sydney has a throwaway line because they're saying how everything that's going on, it's like, horror film, and who would play you? And she says, like, with my luck, they'll cast Tori Spelling. And then they do have Tori Spelling playing Sidney Prescott in the Stab movie, but then later recast. I love those little bits and pieces, and just Scream just goes, it does not skimp on those fun details, and it's just great. And the influence of Scream can't be overstated. Everything that it did for horror films and slashers in the 90s, continuing to this day, and also bringing Wes Craven back as a focal point of horror and bringing him back into the spotlight. Not that he ever would have phased out by any means, but even when he had done New Nightmare in 94, as great as that movie is, it definitely did not receive the same love and popularity that Scream did. And I think because it played things a lot more straight, and Kevin Williams's screenplay did lean into a lot more of the humor and had a bit more, I don't want to say winks to the audience because that makes it sound cheap, but this one, it's like the audience is in on the the meta humor and the commentary. It's not talking down to the audience or anything like that. And I think that's largely why it works, because it is very approachable. Even non-horror fans are aware of the tricks and trades of horror films and slashers in particular. And Scream laughs along with that and pokes fun at it while also treating its characters seriously and allowing it to be genuinely chilling and scary when it needs to be without going over the top brutal in the way that other films might do. It's I think, with the exception of the opening sequence with Casey's death, the kills are, while very bloody, they're still fun. And this movie is both, it's reverential, it's fun, it pokes fun at itself and at slashers, it pokes fun at Wes Craven, but you sense the genuine love and reverence for horror as a genre, for slashers, and I'm so glad that it exists. And I think it's one of the most successful horror franchises. And I'm not saying box office wise, which it still is, but it, the sequels do vary in quality in certain ways, but I think they all remain, very strong on their own, and each brings something new to offer while sticking with that formula and that charm that the original had presented. And now with Scream 6, with a largely new cast, with the only legacy character returning being Courtney Cox as Gale Weathers, I'm really curious to see how it does. And obviously, Wes Craven is not directing since he passed away. Scream 5 pays, just really a lot of respect to Wes, which is very lovely to see. But I am excited for Scream 6, and just judging by how the newer cast, what was done in Scream 5, and Jenna Ortega coming back, absolutely love her. I'm looking forward to it, and maybe I'll actually go see a movie in theaters, which I've been very bad about doing lately. But, maybe I'll share some thoughts about Scream 6 sometime, hopefully soon-ish. But that are some of my thoughts on Scream, and down the line, I think I would like to talk a bit more about the sequels in depth, because they're all so good, and there's just such fun nuggets throughout all of them that deserve to be expanded upon. But until then, this has been me, Aleece, with the Late Late Horror Show, and stay spooky.